You see a photograph from 1950, a black man in a white lab coat, standing in front of shelves lined with glass vials and medical equipment, his expression serious, his eyes tired from decades of work that would save millions of lives across the globe. And yet if you walk down any street in America today and asked 100 people his name, maybe one, maybe none, would know who Dr. Charles Drew was, the man who revolutionized blood storage and created the first large-scale blood banks. The scientist whose innovations kept Allied soldiers alive during World War II, whose techniques are still used in every hospital, every blood drive, every emergency room in the world right now, this very moment, and the tragic irony, the cruel twist that defines so much of African American history, is that this man who gave the world the gift of preserved blood, who made it possible to save countless lives through transfusions, died in 1950 after a car accident, and a myth would spread, a rumor, that haunts American consciousness, that he bled to death because a whites-only hospital refused to treat him. And while historians debate the exact circumstances of his death, what's absolutely certain, what's documented beyond any doubt, is that Charles Drew spent his entire career fighting against a medical establishment that classified blood by race, that labeled blood as white or colored, that treated the fluid running through human veins as if it carried the stain of segregation. And he proved scientifically, irrefutably, that this was nonsense, that blood types matter but skin color doesn't, that an O-negative donor could save an O-negative recipient regardless of race. And yet, even as his innovations saved thousands of white soldiers, even as his techniques became standard practice across the military medical corps, the system he served still demanded segregated blood supplies, still refused to let his genius shield him from Jim Crow's degradation. Charles Richard Drew was born on June 3, 1904, in Washington, D.C., in a middle-class black neighborhood called Foggy Bottom, before it became the home of the State Department and George Washington University, back when it was a community of black families who had escaped the South, who had built lives in the nation's capital, who believed education and excellence could overcome the barriers of race, and Charles, the eldest of 5 children, showed early promise, excelling at Dunbar High School, one of the premier black schools in America, where he wasn't just a scholar but an athlete, a star in football, basketball, track, and swimming, graduating in 1922 with athletic prowess that earned him a scholarship to Amherst College in Massachusetts, one of the few elite northern schools that admitted black students, though admission didn't mean acceptance, didn't mean you could live in the dormitories with white students your first year, didn't mean you wouldn't face the subtle and not so subtle reminders that you were tolerated, not welcomed. At Amherst, Drew continued to excel, winning the Thomas W. Ashley Memorial Trophy as the man who contributed most to athletics during his 4 years there, running track, playing football, and maintaining grades strong enough to get him into medical school. But when he graduated in 1926 and applied to medical schools, he faced the reality that most American medical schools either barred black students entirely or had strict quotas, limiting black enrollment to 1 or 2 per class, if that. So Drew did what thousands of black professionals were forced to do in that era. He looked north, to Canada, to McGill University in Montreal, where he was accepted to the medical school in 1928, where he could pursue his passion without the suffocating restrictions of American racism, at least not to the same degree, though prejudice crossed borders just fine, thank you very much. At McGill, Charles Drew discovered his calling, not in surgery, though he trained in that, not in general practice, though he excelled there too, but in blood, in the science of hematology and transfusion, in the challenge that had stumped doctors and researchers for decades. How do you keep blood fresh? How do you store it? How do you make it available when you need it, where you need it? Because in 1930, when Drew began his research, if you needed a transfusion, you needed a donor right there. Right then, you needed matching blood type, you needed someone willing to lie on a table next to you while doctors transferred blood directly from their vein to yours, arm to arm, life to life. And this meant that emergency transfusions were nearly impossible, that soldiers died on battlefields for lack of blood, that accident victims died in hospitals because no donors were available, that the gift of blood, which could mean the difference between life and death, was trapped in the tyranny of geography and timing. Drew graduated from McGill in 1933, finishing second in his class of 127 students, winning the annual prize in neuroanatomy, earning his medical degree and his Master of Surgery degree, and then he returned to the United States, to Washington, D.C., to Howard University, the historically black institution that became the training ground for generations of African American doctors. Because if you were black in America and you wanted to practice medicine, Howard was often your only option, the place where black excellence was cultivated behind the walls of segregation, where professors trained students to be twice as good because they'd face judges who assumed they were half as competent. And Drew joined the faculty, teaching at Freedman's Hospital, Howard's teaching hospital, performing surgery, training residents, but his mind kept returning to the problem of blood, to the question of storage, to the challenge that could transform emergency medicine if someone could solve it. In 1938, Drew received a Rockefeller Fellowship to pursue his doctorate at Columbia University, to study at the Columbia University Presbyterian Hospital, to work with Dr. John Scudder, a leading expert in transfusion and blood chemistry, and this was Drew's opportunity, his chance to pursue the research that obsessed him, to attack the problem of blood preservation with the full resources of one of America's top medical research institutions, and over the next 2 years, Charles Drew revolutionized the field. He experimented with different preservation techniques, tested various anticoagulants, tried different storage temperatures, examined the cellular breakdown that occurred in stored blood, and he made a discovery, a breakthrough that would change everything. He realized that you didn't need to store whole blood, that you could separate the plasma, the liquid portion of blood, from the red cells, and that plasma could be stored much longer, could be frozen and dried, could be reconstituted and used for transfusions, especially for treating shock, for replacing fluid volume in trauma patients, for keeping people alive until whole blood could be secured. Drew's dissertation, Banked Blood, a study in blood preservation, was groundbreaking. It established the protocols for blood banking that are still used today. It proved that blood could be collected, stored, typed, and made available on demand. It transformed blood from something you needed fresh from a donor into something that could be banked, saved, distributed, and in 1940, Drew received his doctorate, becoming one of the first African Americans to earn a Doctor of Medical Science degree. But more importantly, his timing was perfect because the world was at war, because Britain was being bombed by the Nazis, because British hospitals were overwhelmed with casualties, because soldiers and civilians were bleeding to death in London, in Manchester, in Coventry, because Britain needed blood, needed it desperately, needed it now, and they needed someone who knew how to collect it, store it, and ship it across the Atlantic Ocean. In 1940, the Blood for Britain campaign began, organized by the Blood Transfusion Betterment Association in New York, and they needed a director, someone who understood blood banking, who could organize a massive collection and shipment operation, who could ensure that blood reached Britain in usable condition, and Charles Drew, just months after receiving his doctorate, was appointed medical director of the campaign, the first large-scale blood banking program in history, and he built it from scratch, established procedures for donor recruitment, set standards for blood collection, created protocols for testing and typing, developed methods for plasma separation and preservation, organized a transportation system that could get blood from New York to London in days, not weeks, and over 5 months. From August to December 1940, the Blood for Britain campaign collected more than 14,500 pints of blood, shipped it across the submarine-infested Atlantic, and saved thousands of British lives, soldiers, civilians, men, women, children who owed their survival to the organizational genius of a black doctor from Washington, D.C., who wasn't allowed to donate blood to most American blood banks because of his race. The success of Blood for Britain caught the attention of the American Red Cross because America was gearing up for war, because after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States knew it would need blood, enormous quantities of it, for soldiers fighting in Europe and the Pacific, for the wounded in field hospitals, for casualties being shipped back home. And who better to organize the American blood banking system than the man who had just proved it could be done? So in 1941, Charles Drew was appointed director of the American Red Cross Blood Bank, the organization that would collect and distribute blood for the U.S. military, the largest blood banking operation ever attempted, and Drew threw himself into the work, establishing collection centers, training staff, setting standards, building the infrastructure that would eventually collect millions of units of blood. But there was a problem, a grotesque, unscientific, purely racist problem: the U.S. military, backed by the Red Cross decided that blood donations would be segregated by race, that blood from black donors would be labeled as such, kept separate from white blood, stored in different containers, used only for black recipients when possible, and if that wasn't available, well, better to let a black soldier die than to contaminate a white soldier with black blood. And Charles Drew, the man who proved scientifically that race had nothing to do with blood compatibility, who knew better than anyone on earth that blood types were what mattered, not skin color, was expected to implement and oversee this policy, to build a system based on pseudoscientific racism, to participate in his own degradation and the degradation of every black American who wanted to help the war effort by donating blood. Drew protested, he spoke out, he wrote letters, he gave interviews, he stated publicly and repeatedly that there was no scientific basis for blood segregation, that the policy was medically unsound, that it would cost lives, that it was nothing more than racism dressed up in medical language, and his protests were noted, acknowledged, and ignored because this was 1941 in America, because the military didn't care about the science if the science contradicted white supremacy, because even as black soldiers were being drafted, being trained, being sent to fight and die for American freedom, the blood running through their veins was considered tainted, inferior, dangerous to white bodies, and Charles Drew, brilliant, accomplished, the world's leading expert on blood banking, could do nothing but watch as his innovations were twisted to serve the very racism he had spent his life fighting. In 1942, after just 1 year, Drew resigned as director of the Red Cross Blood Bank. He couldn't continue, couldn't be complicit, couldn't watch as his work was perverted, and he returned to Howard University, to Friedman's Hospital, where he became chief of surgery, where he trained a generation of black surgeons, where he continued his research and his teaching, but the bitter irony never left him, the knowledge that he had given the world the gift of blood banking but couldn't escape the cage of American racism, couldn't even donate his own blood to the system he had created, because in many blood banks across America, black blood was still refused, still considered unfit, still treated as something separate and lesser, and this was the reality Charles Drew lived with for the remaining 8 years of his life, the reality that excellence, genius, life-saving innovation, none of it was enough to shield a black man from Jim Crow, none of it earned you equality, none of it made white America see you as fully human. On April 1, 1950, Charles Drew was driving to a medical conference at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. He had 3 other black doctors with him, colleagues from Howard, and somewhere in rural North Carolina around 8 a.m. Drew apparently fell asleep at the wheel, the car ran off the road, it overturned, and Drew was thrown from the vehicle. His injuries were severe, massive trauma, crushed chest. By the time they got him to the nearest hospital, to Alamance General Hospital in Burlington, North Carolina, the doctors worked on him, they tried, but Drew's injuries were too severe. He died at 1:50 p.m. at age 45, at the peak of his career, his genius silenced, his potential unfulfilled, and within hours, a rumor began to spread. A story that Drew had been refused treatment at a whites-only hospital, that he had bled to death while white doctors turned him away, that the man who revolutionized blood banking died for lack of the very treatment he had made possible. And this story, this myth, spread across black America, passed from person to person, believed because it was believable, because it fit the pattern, because everyone knew of similar stories of black people denied care, of hospitals that turned away dying black patients, of the 1,000 ways that American racism killed black bodies. The truth, as best as historians can determine, is that Drew was treated at Alamance General, that the doctors did attempt to save him, that his injuries were simply too severe, that no hospital, no doctor, no amount of blood could have saved him. But here's what you need to understand. Here's why the myth persists, why it matters, why it tells a deeper truth even if the literal facts are disputed. It's because the myth was plausible, it was believable, it reflected the reality of black life in Jim Crow America, where hospitals did refuse treatment, where black people did die from medical neglect, where the color of your skin determined whether you received care, and Charles Drew had spent his career fighting a medical establishment that treated black blood as contaminated, that segregated the very fluid he proved was colorblind, that implemented racist policies he knew were scientifically baseless. So even if Drew wasn't literally refused treatment, the system he served, the system that used his innovations while treating him as a second-class citizen, bore responsibility for his death just as surely as the car accident did, because the stress of living under constant discrimination, of fighting endless battles for recognition, of watching your genius be accepted while your humanity is denied, this kills too, maybe not in a moment, not in a car crash, but slowly, steadily, surely. Charles Drew's legacy is complicated. He saved millions of lives. His blood banking techniques are used worldwide. Every blood drive, every Red Cross collection, every emergency transfusion, every surgery that requires blood on hand, all of this exists because of Drew's innovations, because of his research, because of his organizational genius, and yet most Americans don't know his name, don't learn his story, don't understand that the blood banking system that serves them today was created by a black scientist who was considered unfit to donate to the system he built. And when Drew's story is told, it's often reduced to the myth of his death, to the tragic irony that may or may not have occurred, rather than celebrating the triumphs of his life, the barriers he broke, the lives he saved, the students he trained, the excellence he embodied. At Howard University, Drew trained generations of black surgeons. He established high standards, demanded excellence, prepared his students for the discrimination they would face, taught them to be so skilled that their competence could not be questioned, and his legacy lives on through them, through the doctors who learned from him, who carried his teachings forward, who continued the tradition of black medical excellence that Drew represented. And in 1981, 31 years after his death, the U.S. Postal Service issued a stamp in his honor, recognizing his contributions, and in 1976, the Charles R. Drew Postgraduate Medical School was founded in Los Angeles, a teaching hospital that continues his mission of training doctors to serve underserved communities. But these honors, deserved as they are, came after his death, came when he couldn't see them, couldn't know that history would eventually recognize what his contemporaries denied, that his genius would be celebrated even if his humanity was devalued. The story of Charles Drew forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about American history, about how we treat black excellence, about how we accept the gifts of black genius while denying black people full humanity, about systems that will use your innovations, profit from your labor, save lives with your discoveries, and still treat you as less than, still deny you the dignity you deserve, still implement policies that degrade and segregate you. And Drew's story is not unique, it's part of a pattern, a painful pattern that runs through African American history, of black scientists like George Washington Carver, who revolutionized agriculture, of black inventors like Garrett Morgan, who invented the traffic signal and gas mask, of black mathematicians like Katherine Johnson, whose calculations sent Americans to the moon, of countless others whose contributions were essential, whose genius was undeniable, whose humanity was still questioned, whose names were forgotten or footnoted or erased entirely from the history books, replaced by white colleagues who got the credit, the recognition, the rewards that should have been shared. You need to know Charles Drew's name, you need to tell his story, you need to understand that the blood running through your veins right now, that could save your life in an emergency, that sits waiting in blood banks across the world, is there because a black scientist fought against racism, against segregation, against the medical establishment that devalued him, to prove that blood is blood, that life is life, that the color of your skin has nothing to do with the fluid that keeps your heart beating, and he proved it scientifically, irrefutably, permanently, and yet he lived and died in a nation that refused to accept this truth, that continued to segregate blood, to classify donors by race, to implement policies that contradicted everything Drew's research had demonstrated. And this is the tragedy of Charles Drew, not just his early death, not just the myth that surrounds it, but the reality that his genius was never enough to earn him equality, that his life-saving innovations couldn't protect him from Jim Crow, that he saved millions but died knowing that American society still considered him and every other black person as fundamentally less than white people, unworthy of the same dignity, the same respect, the same basic human recognition. Drew's story reminds us that progress is not linear, that scientific advancement doesn't automatically translate to social justice, that you can prove something beyond doubt and still have people refuse to accept it, because racism isn't about facts, it's about power, it's about maintaining hierarchies, It's about protecting privilege, and no amount of black excellence, no accumulation of achievement, no demonstration of genius will dismantle these systems by itself. It takes resistance. It takes protest. It takes the courage that Drew showed when he spoke out against blood segregation, knowing it would cost him professionally, knowing it would make him enemies, knowing it would achieve nothing in the short term, but speaking truth anyway, standing on principle anyway, refusing to be complicit anyway, because that's what integrity demands, that's what dignity requires, that's what black people have always done in America. Excelled despite the obstacles, achieved despite the discrimination, created despite the degradation, innovated despite the insults, and Drew embodied this tradition, carried this burden, lived this contradiction. Today, when you see a blood drive, when you donate blood, when someone you love receives a transfusion, when a soldier survives on a battlefield, when a surgery proceeds safely with blood on hand, when an accident victim lives because blood was available, remember Charles Drew. Remember the black scientist whose innovations made all of this possible, whose genius gave the world the gift of blood banking, whose resistance challenged medical racism, whose legacy lives on every time blood saves a life, and share his story, teach his name, ensure that the next generation knows who Charles Drew was, what he accomplished, what he endured, what he proved, because this is how we honor him, by refusing to let his story be forgotten, by insisting that black contributions be recognized, by teaching the full truth of American history, including the painful parts, including the injustices, including the ways that America has always depended on black genius while denying black humanity, and by committing ourselves to building a nation where the next Charles Drew, the next black scientist with world-changing innovations, can live and work and thrive without facing the discrimination that Drew endured, where excellence is rewarded regardless of skin color, where blood is understood as what Drew proved it to be, a gift of life that knows no race, no color, no boundary except our shared humanity. And that is the least we owe to the memory of Dr. Charles Richard Drew, the man who saved millions but died unknown to most, the scientist whose legacy flows through every blood bank in the world, the black American whose genius changed history even as history tried to erase him.